I'm Natasha Kippen, 32 years old, and I've spent my career in emergency management, the kind of work where you coordinate disaster relief and save lives behind the scenes. For years, I was my younger sister Emily's safety net, covering her wedding costs, taking her crisis calls, and making sure she always had someone to catch her when she fell. But when she looked me in the eye at her Navy husband's promotion ceremony and said, "You're just a nobody here. Don't make this about you," I made a decision that changed our relationship forever. Have you ever been dismissed by someone you sacrificed everything for? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone in this. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to reclaim your worth after being treated like you were worthless, smash that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened when the base commander called my name that night will shock you. I was 12 when Dad left us with nothing but unpaid bills and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly in the silence. Mom worked double shifts at the diner, so it fell to me to make sure the lights stayed on and Emily had clean clothes for school. She was only 8 then, all skin, knees, and wild hair, completely unaware that our world had just collapsed around us. While she colored pictures and watched cartoons, I learned how to stretch a dollar and talk utility companies into one more extension. Emily never had to grow up the way I did. I made sure of that. When she forgot her lunch money, I gave her mine. When she needed help with homework, I stayed up late walking her through fractions and state capitals, even though I was exhausted from my own studies and the part-time job I'd picked up at 15. She moved through childhood like it was her birthright, never questioning where the safety net came from or who wove it beneath her feet. By the time we were both adults, this pattern had calcified into something neither of us acknowledged directly. Emily chased dreams with the confidence of someone who'd never had to calculate the cost of failure. She moved to California to be an actress, then to Colorado for a ski instructor certification, then to Florida because she'd met a guy who promised her the world. Each time, when the dream dissolved or the guy turned out to be married or broke, she called me. Not to apologize or explain, but to process her disappointment while I listened and offered practical advice about getting back on her feet. I didn't mind it, really. Or maybe I'd convinced myself I didn't mind it because minding it felt petty. She was my sister, and taking care of her had become so automatic that I rarely questioned whether she'd do the same for me. The answer seemed obvious anyway. Emily wasn't built for emergencies or sacrifice. She was built for sunshine and spontaneity, and there was something beautiful about that, even when it left me holding the bag. When she met Daniel at a beach volleyball tournament in San Diego, I knew immediately that this one was different. Not because he was more reliable than the others, though he was, but because Emily talked about him differently. She didn't just want him, she wanted the life he represented. Daniel was career military, all pressed uniforms and clear objectives, and Emily saw in him the stability she'd never had to create for herself. Their engagement was a whirlwind of Pinterest boards and bridal magazines. Emily threw herself into wedding planning with the same intensity she'd once reserved for her various pursuits, except this time the stakes felt permanent. When she called me 3 months before the ceremony, her voice tight with panic, I knew what was coming before she said it. "The catering fell through," she said. "And the backup wants twice what we budgeted. Mom already gave us everything she could and Daniel's parents." She trailed off, but I filled in the blanks. His parents thought she was flighty, that the marriage wouldn't last. They weren't wrong about the first part, but they underestimated Daniel's devotion. I had been saving for a down payment on a house, something I'd been working toward for 3 years. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover the difference between Emily's dream wedding and the reality of her budget. When I offered it, she cried with relief and gratitude, promising to pay me back as soon as they got settled. The wedding was beautiful. Emily glowed in a way that made every sacrifice worth it, and Daniel looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. During the reception, she pulled me aside and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I couldn't have done this without you," she whispered. "You're the best sister anyone could ask for." I believed her then. I believed that this gratitude was real, that it would translate into something lasting between us. I believed that marriage would mature her, that Daniel's steady presence would help her see the value of consistency and reciprocity. I believed that finally, after all these years, we'd have the kind of relationship where the giving went both ways. The first few months seemed to prove me right. Emily called regularly, full of stories about Navy life and the other wives she was getting to know. She sent pictures of their base housing and complained good-naturedly about Daniel's long hours. She seemed settled in a way I'd never seen before, and I felt proud of the role I'd played in getting her there. It was subtle at first, the way things began to change. Phone calls became shorter, less frequent. When I asked about her new friends or what she was doing with her time, her answers grew vague. She talked more about Navy protocol and proper channels and less about the small details of daily life that had always filled our conversations. When I visited them for the first time after the wedding, she introduced me to her neighbors as my sister from back home, with a tone that somehow made back home sound like a place she'd outgrown. I told myself it was normal. New marriages required adjustment, and Emily was working hard to fit into Daniel's world. Of course, she was focused on making a good impression. Of course, she wanted to establish herself as a proper Navy wife. Of course, there would be growing pains. The distance wasn't personal, it was practical. But even as I made these excuses, something in my chest began to tighten. For the first time in my life, I started to wonder if all those years of stepping up and stepping in had been as one-sided as they'd felt. And if they had been, what that said about both of us. The changes in Emily's attitude didn't happen overnight, but looking back, I can pinpoint when the shift became undeniable. It was during Daniel's first promotion ceremony, about 18 months after their wedding. I'd flown out to California to attend, expecting to share in their celebration the way families do. Instead, I found myself watching Emily perform a version of herself I barely recognized. She'd always been social, but now there was a calculated quality to her interactions. She name-dropped the other officers' wives like she was collecting trading cards, and every conversation seemed designed to establish her place in an invisible hierarchy. When she introduced me to her new friends, it was with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and explanations that felt like disclaimers. "This is my sister," she'd say, then quickly add, "she's still figuring out her career path," or "she's not familiar with military life, so be patient with her." These weren't lies exactly, but they weren't the whole truth either. Yes, I was working in nonprofit management, which didn't sound glamorous at cocktail parties. Yes, I was single and had never navigated the complex social structure of a military base. But the way Emily presented these facts made them sound like character flaws rather than simply different life choices. The most telling moment came during the ceremony itself. Daniel looked sharp in his dress uniform, and I felt genuinely proud watching him accept his new rank. When the formal portion ended and everyone moved to the reception, I started toward Emily and Daniel to congratulate them. But Emily intercepted me before I could reach them, her hand firm on my arm. "Let us make our rounds first," she said quietly. "There are some important people Daniel needs to talk to, and we can't get caught up in family conversations right now." The word family came out like it tasted bitter. I stepped back and watched her work the room instead, noting how she mirrored the mannerisms of the senior officers' wives, how she laughed at jokes that weren't funny, how she positioned herself in photographs to be seen with the right people. When she finally made it back to me near the end of the evening, her demeanor had shifted again. "Sorry about earlier," she said, but her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "You understand how these things work, right? Daniel's career depends on networking." I nodded because what else could I do? But something had crystallized in that moment, a recognition that Emily wasn't just adapting to Navy life. She was using it as justification for treating me like a liability rather than a sister. Over the following months, this pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency. When I called, Emily often seemed distracted, cutting conversations short because she had wives' club obligations or social commitments. When I sent care packages or birthday gifts, her thank you notes were perfunctory, focused more on how busy she was than on any appreciation for the gesture. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult period in my own life. I'd been laid off from my nonprofit job due to budget cuts, and while I wasn't in financial crisis, the uncertainty was taking its toll. When I called Emily to talk through my feelings and maybe get some sisterly support, her response was stunning in its coldness. "You know, maybe this is a sign that you should finally get serious about your career," she said. "I mean, you're 32. You can't keep floating around in these do-gooder jobs that don't lead anywhere." The words hit me like a physical blow, not just because they were cruel, but because they revealed how completely Emily had rewritten our history. In her new narrative, I was the irresponsible one, the one who needed to get serious. My years of stability and sacrifice had been erased, replaced by a story that positioned her as the successful sister who'd figured out how to build a real life. I ended that call feeling like I'd been talking to a stranger. The Emily who'd hugged me at her wedding reception, who'd thanked me for making her dreams possible, had been replaced by someone who saw my presence in her life as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a relationship to be cherished. But perhaps the most painful part was recognizing my own role in creating this dynamic. By always being the one who stepped up, who smoothed over problems, who asked for nothing in return, I'd taught Emily that my value lay in my utility rather than in any inherent worth as her sister. I'd been so focused on taking care of her that I'd never demanded she learn to take care of me. Now, as Daniel's next promotion approached, I found myself questioning whether I wanted to continue playing a role in a story where I'd been cast as the supporting character in my own family. When the invitation arrived for Daniel's promotion to lieutenant commander, my first instinct was to decline. The elegant cardstock felt heavy in my hands, and Emily's handwriting on the envelope looked different somehow, more formal, less familiar. But declining felt like admitting defeat, like confirming Emily's apparent belief that I didn't belong in their new world. So I bought a plane ticket and a dress that I hoped would help me blend in with the other guests. I told myself this would be different, that maybe the distance I'd been feeling was all in my head, that seeing Emily in person would restore some of the warmth that seemed to have evaporated from our phone conversations. The base looked impressive in the evening light, all polished surfaces and American flags snapping in the ocean breeze. I followed the directions to the officers' club, my heels clicking against the pavement as I joined a stream of people in formal attire. The women wore cocktail dresses in conservative colors, and the men were either in dress uniforms or dark suits. I'd chosen correctly, at least in terms of attire. Inside, the club buzzed with conversation and the soft clinking of glasses. I spotted Emily immediately. She had that quality of drawing attention even in a crowd, and tonight she looked radiant in a navy blue dress that complemented Daniel's uniform perfectly. I made my way toward them, practicing a smile and preparing to be gracious about whatever awkwardness had developed between us. But Emily saw me coming and moved to intercept me before I could reach Daniel, who was deep in conversation with a group of senior officers. Her smile was bright, but somehow cold, like a spotlight that illuminated without warming. "You made it," she said, and there was something in her tone that made it sound like she hadn't expected me to follow through. "Listen, I need to talk to you about tonight." She guided me toward a quieter corner of the room, her hand on my elbow in a way that felt more controlling than sisterly. Other guests continued to arrive, and I could see Emily's eyes tracking them even as she spoke to me. "This is really important for Daniel's career," she began, and I could already sense where this was heading. "There are some very senior people here tonight, including the base commander and Daniel's new CO. First impressions matter in the Navy and—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. When she found them, they cut deeper than I thought words could. "You're just a nobody here. Don't make this about you." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not because Emily had never been thoughtless before, but because this felt different, calculated rather than careless. She looked at me and decided that my presence posed a threat to something she valued more than our relationship. I stood there for a moment, letting the words settle into my understanding of who my sister had become. Around us, the party continued, full of laughter and celebration and people who belonged in ways that I apparently didn't. Emily was already looking past me toward the crowd, her attention moving on to more important considerations. "I understand," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I understood anything anymore. Emily's relief was visible. "Good. Just keep a low profile, okay? Find a seat somewhere in the back and enjoy the ceremony. The food is supposed to be amazing." She squeezed my arm in what might have been intended as an affectionate gesture, then moved away to rejoin Daniel and his colleagues. I watched her transform as she approached them, her posture straightening, her smile becoming more animated, her whole presence brightening in a way that made it clear where she felt she truly belonged. I found a seat near the back, as instructed, and sat down carefully to avoid wrinkling my dress. The chair was uncomfortable, and the angle made it difficult to see the front of the room where the ceremony would take place. But maybe that was appropriate. Maybe this was exactly where someone like me, someone who was just a nobody, was supposed to sit. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent most of my life making sure Emily had a place at every table, and now she was telling me I didn't deserve a seat at hers. But as I sat there, watching her work the room with practiced charm, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I was sad, deeply and exhaustively sad, but I wasn't angry. Instead, I felt a kind of clarity settling over me, cold and clean as winter air. For the first time in my adult life, I was seeing Emily exactly as she was rather than as I'd always hoped she might become. And for the first time, I was seeing myself clearly too, not as the indispensable big sister, but as someone who'd been so afraid of being abandoned that I'd never demanded to be truly seen. The ceremony was about to begin. I settled back in my uncomfortable chair and prepared to witness my sister's triumph from the distance she'd assigned me, wondering if this would be the last time I'd accept an invitation to be treated as less than I was worth. Sitting in that back row, I felt something shift inside me, not the sharp crack of heartbreak, but the slow, inevitable settling that comes when you finally stop fighting gravity. For 32 years, I'd been Emily's safety net, her problem solver, her unconditional supporter. Tonight, she'd made it clear that my role in her life was now a source of embarrassment rather than gratitude. The crowd quieted as the ceremony began, and I found myself replaying conversations from the past 2 years, looking for signs I'd missed. Emily's increasing references to knowing the right people. Her subtle corrections of my grammar or posture when we were around her Navy friends. The way she'd started describing my work as charity stuff instead of nonprofit management. I'd attributed these changes to her trying to fit in, but now I could see them for what they really were, Emily systematically distancing herself from the parts of her past that didn't match her new image. The base commander took the podium, a distinguished man with silver hair and ribbons across his chest that spoke to decades of service. He began talking about leadership and sacrifice, about the men and women who served not for recognition, but because service itself was a calling. His words were predictable but sincere, and I found myself listening despite my emotional state. Daniel stood at attention with the other officers being promoted, his posture perfect, his expression focused. I could see why Emily had fallen for him. He radiated confidence and reliability, qualities that probably felt like solid ground to someone who'd spent her life improvising. But watching him now, I wondered if he knew how ruthlessly Emily was editing her history to fit into his world. Did he know about the wedding money, the late-night crisis calls, the years of stability I'd provided while she found her footing? Or had those stories been reframed as evidence of my neediness rather than my generosity? The ceremony proceeded through the formal elements, oaths recited, pins exchanged, salutes given and received. Emily watched from the front row, her face glowing with pride and satisfaction. She belonged here, in this room full of people who understood military protocol and career advancement strategies. She'd earned her place through marriage, but she'd also worked to secure it through careful social navigation and deliberate self-presentation. I couldn't fault her for wanting to succeed in her new environment. What hurt was her apparent belief that my presence threatened that success, that loving me publicly would somehow diminish her standing with people who mattered more than I did. As the formal portion concluded and guests began to mingle again, I remained in my seat, watching Emily work the room with practiced efficiency. She moved from group to group like she was checking items off a list, spending exactly the right amount of time with each person, saying exactly the right things to maintain momentum without appearing pushy. It was impressive in its way, this social choreography she'd mastered. The wives of senior officers welcomed her into their conversations, and she mirrored their body language, their vocal patterns, their shared references to Navy life. She'd become fluent in a language I'd never learned, and watching her use it, I realized that my presence really might be a liability. Not because there was anything wrong with me, but because I represented a version of Emily that she was actively trying to leave behind. The woman she'd been when she needed my help, when she called me crying from various failed ventures, when she didn't know how to balance a checkbook or negotiate with landlords, that woman had been authentic, but she'd also been vulnerable. The woman she was now had traded vulnerability for belonging, spontaneity for security, authenticity for acceptance. I couldn't decide if this transformation was growth or loss, probably because it was both. A server approached my table with champagne, and I accepted a glass, thinking I might as well try to enjoy the evening since I was here. The champagne was good, better than anything I usually drank, and for a moment I imagined what it would be like to be someone who belonged at events like this, someone whose presence enhanced rather than threatened the people she loved. But even as I entertained the fantasy, I knew it wasn't really what I wanted. I didn't envy Emily's new life so much as I mourned the relationship we'd lost in her pursuit of it. The sister who'd hugged me at her wedding reception, who'd promised she couldn't have made it without me, had been replaced by someone who apparently wished she had made it without me. The most painful part was recognizing my own complicity in this dynamic. By always being the one who gave, who solved, who supported without asking for support in return, I'd trained Emily to see my love as a given rather than a gift. I'd been so focused on being indispensable that I'd never insisted on being valued. Now, sitting in the back of this room full of strangers, I finally understood that unconditional love, when it's truly unconditional, eventually becomes worthless to the person receiving it. Emily had learned to take my devotion for granted because I'd never given her a reason to question its availability. The realization was liberating and devastating in equal measure. For the first time in my adult life, I was considering what it might mean to love my sister conditionally, to require respect as the price of my support, to demand reciprocity as evidence of genuine care. I'd made a decision without fully realizing it, sitting there in my assigned seat in the back. Not a decision born of anger or revenge, but something quieter and more permanent, a choice to stop participating in the diminishment of my own worth. If Emily wanted to treat me like an embarrassment, I would no longer work to prove her wrong. If she decided I was just a nobody, I would let her live with that assessment rather than exhaust myself fighting it. This wasn't about punishment or making a point. It was about finally accepting that you can't love someone into valuing you, and that decades of one-sided giving had taught my sister to expect my devotion without offering her own in return. The kindest thing I could do, for both of us, was to step back and let her experience the natural consequences of her choices. The decision felt like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. For the first time since arriving, I relaxed in my chair, no longer scanning the room to see if Emily needed anything or monitoring her interactions for signs that she might benefit from my support. She was an adult who'd made it clear she preferred to handle her social obligations without my involvement. I could honor that preference. Around me, the reception continued with the smooth efficiency of a well-planned military event. Servers moved between tables with appetizers and drinks, conversations flowed in predictable patterns of professional networking and social pleasantries, and Daniel moved through the crowd accepting congratulations with appropriate humility. It was all very civilized and pleasant, the kind of event where everyone knew their role and played it well. Except that the evening was about to take a turn none of us had anticipated. The base commander returned to the podium, tapping his glass to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted expectantly, assuming he was about to offer final congratulations or perhaps share a closing anecdote about military service. Instead, his expression was serious as he surveyed the room. "Before we conclude tonight's ceremony," he said, "I want to take a moment to recognize someone whose contributions to our military community may not be widely known, but whose actions have had a profound impact on the lives of our sailors and their families." I felt a strange prickle of attention, though I couldn't have said why. Emily had moved closer to the front, positioning herself where she could be easily seen if any acknowledgement was forthcoming for the families of the promoted officers. The commander continued, 3 years ago, during Hurricane Maria, when communication systems failed and normal aid channels were overwhelmed, our sailors stationed in Puerto Rico found themselves cut off from both official support and their families stateside. It was a civilian volunteer who stepped in to coordinate critical assistance, someone who used her professional network in emergency management to ensure our people had access to food, medical supplies, and communication with their loved ones. My champagne glass had gone still in my hand. I knew where this was going, though I couldn't quite believe it was happening. That volunteer worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks, navigating bureaucratic obstacles and coordinating between military and civilian agencies to make sure our sailors didn't fall through the cracks. Several members of Lieutenant Commander Morrison's unit were among those who benefited directly from her efforts. The commander's eyes swept the room and found mine with unmistakable certainty. "Would you please join me on stage? I'd like the room to meet the woman who saved this unit." The silence that followed was complete. Every head in the room turned toward me, including Emily's, and I could see the shock on her face even from my distant seat. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the commander was still looking at me expectantly, and the room was waiting. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, and began the long walk to the front of the room. With each step, the magnitude of what was occurring became more real. Emily had spent the evening positioning herself as the important one, the one who deserved recognition and attention, while relegating me to the background as someone who didn't belong. Now, in front of everyone who mattered to her new life, I was being called forward as the guest of honor. Walking toward the podium felt like moving through water. Everything slowed and heightened at the same time. I was aware of every eye in the room following my progress, of the soft click of my heels against the polished floor, of Emily's face as I passed her table. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, all the color drained from her cheeks, her carefully composed expression completely shattered. The commander extended his hand as I reached the stage, his smile warm and genuine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning back to the audience, "I'd like you to meet the woman who, when our official channels failed, became the lifeline between our sailors and the resources they desperately needed." The applause began slowly, then built into something overwhelming, not polite acknowledgement, but genuine appreciation from people who understood the weight of what he was describing. I found Daniel in the crowd, and for the first time that evening, his expression toward me was one of complete recognition. He knew exactly what I'd done, even if his wife had never told him the full story. "I don't think many of you realize," the commander continued as the applause died down, "that during those critical 2 weeks, this woman slept maybe 3 hours a night, coordinating between FEMA, the Red Cross, local emergency services, and our military command to ensure that our people had access to clean water, medical supplies, and communication with their families. She didn't do this for recognition or compensation. She did it because she saw people in need and had the skills to help." He turned to me then, his voice carrying the weight of institutional gratitude. "The Navy doesn't forget its friends. Your actions during that crisis exemplified the very best of civilian-military cooperation, and several of the sailors you helped are in this room tonight." I managed to find my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. "I was just doing what anyone would do," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "No," the commander replied firmly. "What you did required expertise, dedication, and a level of personal sacrifice that went far beyond what anyone could expect from a volunteer. The after-action reports from that crisis specifically cited your coordination efforts as instrumental in preventing what could have been a humanitarian disaster for our deployed personnel." The room erupted in applause again, and this time people were standing. First Daniel, then the other officers, then their wives, until the entire room was on its feet. I stood there in the spotlight, overwhelmed by recognition I'd never sought and never expected, acutely aware that Emily was still seated, still staring at me like I'd somehow cheated by being more than she'd decided I was. Later, people would tell me how graciously I handled that moment, how poised I looked accepting recognition for service I'd never thought to mention. The truth was messy. I felt exposed and disoriented, struggling to reconcile this public acknowledgement with the private dismissal I'd received just hours earlier from the person whose opinion had always mattered most to me. But something else was happening too, something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. For years, I'd measured my worth through Emily's eyes, accepting her assessment of my value as definitive truth. Standing on that stage, receiving appreciation from people who had no reason to diminish or inflate my contributions, I was getting a different mirror, one that reflected back capabilities and impact I'd somehow learned to minimize. The commander shook my hand again, and I made my way back to my seat through a gauntlet of people who wanted to thank me personally or share their own stories from that difficult time. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach my table, and by the time I sat down, the formal portion of the evening was over and guests were beginning to disperse. Emily appeared beside my chair almost immediately, her face a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't entirely read. "Why didn't you ever tell me about Puerto Rico?" she asked, her voice tight with something between accusation and confusion. I looked up at her, this sister who'd spent the evening treating me like a liability, and felt something click into place. "You never asked," I said simply. "And after tonight, I think maybe you didn't really want to know." The recognition ceremony hadn't been about revenge or vindication. It had been about truth, the simple, powerful truth that people are often much more than the roles others assign to them. Emily had spent months reducing me to an embarrassing reminder of her past, but I'd always been exactly who I was tonight, with or without her acknowledgement. Standing ovation or not, her opinion of me was just that, an opinion, not an objective assessment of my worth. Emily didn't leave immediately after my response. She lingered beside my chair, clearly struggling with something she couldn't quite articulate. Around us, other guests were beginning to gather their belongings and say their goodbyes, but she seemed frozen in place, staring at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complicated than she'd expected. "I don't understand," she finally said. "You've had all these conversations with Daniel about hurricane relief work? When? I never heard you mention any of this." The question revealed so much about how thoroughly she'd edited me out of any meaningful narrative about her life. Daniel and I had spoken several times over the past 3 years, not lengthy conversations, but enough that he clearly knew about my work in emergency management and my involvement in disaster response. Emily's surprise that these conversations had occurred told me she'd simply stopped paying attention to who I was beyond my function as her perpetual backup plan. "We've talked maybe 4 or 5 times," I said. "Usually when you stepped away during family calls, or that time when you were sick and he answered your phone. He mentioned Puerto Rico once, and I told him I'd been there working with some of the naval stations. It wasn't a secret, Emily. It just wasn't something you were interested in hearing about." Her face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to something that might have been recognition, then hardening into something defensive. "Well, how was I supposed to know you were doing important work if you never mentioned it?" This was classic Emily, deflecting responsibility by reframing the situation as somehow my fault. But for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to absorb her deflection or make excuses for her selective attention. The applause was still echoing in my mind, reminding me that my worth wasn't actually subject to her approval. "I mentioned it several times," I said calmly. "You usually change the subject or seem distracted." Which was fine. Not everyone finds emergency management fascinating. But don't pretend you weren't given opportunities to know who I've become. Daniel appeared at Emily's shoulder then, his expression warm but slightly awkward. "Congratulations on the recognition," he said to me, then glanced at Emily. "I tried to tell you about your sister's work, remember?" After that conversation we had about civilian contractors and hurricane response. Emily's face went pale again. Clearly, she did remember, or at least remembered dismissing whatever Daniel had tried to share with her about me. The weight of her own choices was settling on her shoulders, and watching her process it, I felt a mixture of sadness and something that might have been relief. "We should probably head out," Daniel continued, still addressing Emily. "Early day tomorrow, and I want to thank everyone before they leave." Emily nodded but didn't move immediately. She was still looking at me with that puzzled expression, like she couldn't quite reconcile the sister she'd been dismissing with the person who'd just been honored in front of everyone she was trying to impress. "Maybe we could get coffee sometime this week," she said suddenly. "Before you fly back? I feel like we need to catch up properly." It was an olive branch of sorts, the one that came with the assumption that I'd be grateful enough for her renewed attention to pretend the evening's earlier humiliation hadn't happened. A month ago, I probably would have accepted immediately, eager to restore whatever connection we could salvage and willing to overlook her behavior if it meant having my sister back. But sitting there, still feeling the warmth of genuine appreciation from people who saw me clearly, I found I wasn't quite ready to return to the familiar pattern of accepting crumbs of Emily's attention whenever she decided I might be worth her time after all. "I'll think about it," I said, which was true. I would think about it. About whether a coffee meeting where she controlled the agenda and the narrative would actually serve either of us. About whether she was interested in rebuilding our relationship or just managing the awkwardness of having misjudged me so publicly. Emily's surprise was visible. This wasn't the response she'd expected from the sister who'd always been grateful for any opportunity to connect with her. But the sister who'd walked into this room earlier tonight wasn't quite the same person who was sitting here now. The standing ovation hadn't changed who I was, but it had changed how willing I was to accept other people's diminished versions of me. "Okay," Emily said after a moment, her voice uncertain. I'll call you tomorrow." "If you want to," I replied, neither encouraging nor discouraging her. For the first time in our relationship, I was letting her decide how much effort she wanted to invest in knowing me, rather than making it easy for her by doing all the emotional work myself. They left together, Daniel's hand on Emily's back in a gesture of support that suggested he understood she was processing something difficult. I watched them go, feeling unexpectedly peaceful. Whatever happened next between Emily and me would happen because we both chose it, not because I'd made myself indispensable to her comfort. The recognition ceremony had been nice, but this moment, this quiet claiming of my own worth, felt like the real victory. The weeks that followed played out exactly as I'd expected they would. Emily called the next day, her voice carefully modulated in a way that told me she'd been thinking hard about how to approach our conversation. She apologized for her behavior at the promotion ceremony, though the apology was cushioned with explanations about stress and pressure and not being herself lately. I listened without rushing to reassure her that it was fine, that I understood, that she didn't need to worry about it. Those responses had always come automatically before, part of my well-practiced role as the accommodating sister. But they didn't come now, and the silence where they should have been seemed to unsettle her. "I keep thinking about what the commander said," she continued when I didn't fill the gap. "About Puerto Rico, I mean. I had no idea you were involved in anything that significant." The word significant hung between us, loaded with implications we both understood. My work had always been significant to me, but until it was validated by people Emily considered important, it hadn't registered as significant to her. This recognition felt more revealing than flattering. "It was my job," I said simply. "I've been doing emergency response coordination for 6 years. This kind of work is what I do." "But why didn't you ever talk about it? I mean, really talk about it?" This question had been coming since the night of the ceremony, and I'd been thinking about how to answer it honestly without descending into old patterns of blame and defense. The truth was complicated, involving years of learned dynamics that we'd both participated in creating. "I did talk about it, You just weren't really listening." And after a while, when someone consistently shows you they're not interested in what you have to say, you stop trying to say it. The silence on her end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller than before. "I guess I thought your work was just, filing paperwork and coordinating volunteers for local stuff. I didn't realize you were working on anything that big." This admission revealed the fundamental problem that had been growing between us. Emily had created a version of me in her mind that was smaller and less capable than reality. And she'd held on to that version because it served her sense of herself as the more successful, more important sister. My actual accomplishments threatened that narrative, so she'd simply chosen not to see them. "I know," I said, and meant it. Had known for months that she'd been systematically minimizing my life to fit her preferred story about our respective positions in the world. Understanding it didn't make it hurt less, but it did make it less personal. This was about Emily's insecurities, not about any actual deficiency in me. We made tentative plans to meet for coffee before I flew back east, though I could hear in her voice that she wasn't sure what she wanted from the conversation. The confident woman who dismissed me at the promotion ceremony had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely uncertain about how to proceed with a sister she'd apparently never bothered to know. When we met 3 days later at a cafe near the base, Emily looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. She'd always been someone who moved through the world with easy confidence, but now she seemed tentative, like she wasn't sure which version of herself to bring to this conversation. "I keep thinking about that night," she said after we'd ordered our drinks. "About what I said to you. About calling you a nobody." I waited for her to continue, resisting the urge to make this easier for her by rushing to forgiveness. "The thing is," she said slowly, "I think I convinced myself that you were happy being, I don't know, background support. Like you preferred not being in the spotlight, so it was okay to treat you like you didn't want to be there." This was closer to honesty than she'd come in years, an acknowledgement that she'd constructed a story about my preferences that justified her behavior. But it was still a story that centered her comfort rather than examining her choices. "I never said I preferred being background support," I replied. "You decided that's what I wanted because it made it easier for you to put me there." Her face crumpled slightly, and for a moment she looked like the little girl I'd taken care of all those years ago. But she wasn't a little girl anymore, and the pain in her expression didn't automatically make me responsible for fixing whatever she was feeling. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally. "Maybe you don't need to fix it," I said. "Maybe you just need to decide what kind of relationship you actually want with me, based on who I really am rather than who you've decided I should be." We talked for another hour, circling around topics we'd never addressed directly: the money for her wedding that she'd never paid back, the years of crisis calls that had always flowed one direction, the way she'd rewritten our family history to position herself as the one who'd escaped dysfunction rather than the one who'd been protected from it. None of it was resolved by the time we hugged goodbye, but something had shifted. Emily seemed to finally understand that I wasn't going to return to our old dynamic just because she was ready to acknowledge my worth. If she wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be one built on mutual respect rather than habitual obligation. I flew home feeling lighter than I had in months, carrying with me the memory of that standing ovation, but also something more valuable: the knowledge that I didn't need anyone's applause to know my own worth. The real transformation hadn't happened on the stage that night. It had happened in the quiet decision to stop accepting less than I deserved from people who claimed to love me. Emily might come around to seeing me clearly, or she might not. Either way, I would be fine. For the first time in my adult life, I was more interested in being respected than in being needed. And that shift, more than any recognition ceremony, felt like coming home to myself. Months later, I can see that night at the promotion ceremony for what it really was: not a moment of vindication or revenge, but a turning point that forced both Emily and me to confront the truth about our relationship. The applause was gratifying, but the real victory was in finally understanding that my worth had never been dependent on her recognition of it. Emily and I talk now, occasionally, with the careful politeness of people who are learning to know each other as adults rather than falling back into the patterns we established as children. She's made efforts to ask about my work, to remember details about my life, to show interest in who I've become rather than who she remembers me being. But there's a distance between us now that wasn't there before, the natural distance that exists between people who have different values and priorities. I no longer organize my life around being available for her emergencies, and she no longer assumes that availability is automatic. We've both had to learn new ways of being sisters, ways that don't require one of us to diminish ourselves for the other's comfort. Sometimes I miss the easy intimacy we had when we were younger, before Emily decided that loving me was somehow incompatible with succeeding in her new world. But I don't miss the exhaustion of constantly proving my worth to someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth much. I don't miss the resentment that had been building in me, or the way I'd started to question my own value, because hers was the opinion that mattered most to me. The woman who stood up that night to accept recognition for work she'd never thought to brag about was the same woman who'd always been there, solving problems and supporting people and making things work. The only difference was that she'd finally stopped accepting other people's edited versions of her story. That's the legacy of that evening, really. Not the applause or the acknowledgement, but the quiet revolution of finally knowing that being dismissed by someone doesn't make you dismissible, that being underestimated doesn't make you less than you are. Emily taught me something valuable that night, though probably not what she intended. She taught me the difference between being loved and being valued, between being needed and being respected. I carry myself differently now, not as someone who has to earn her place at the table, but as someone who knows exactly what she brings to any room she enters. The applause was nice, but learning to applaud myself, that was everything. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed quiet in that back row, or would you have confronted Emily right there in front of everyone? Drop a comment and let me know, have you ever had a family member treat you like you were less than you deserved? How did you handle it? I read every single comment, and your stories help other people realize they're not alone in these situations. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more real-life stories about family drama, setting boundaries, and finding your self-worth. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when I share a new story. And here's my question for you. Do you think Emily and I will ever have a truly close relationship again, or are some betrayals too deep to fully repair? Let me know what you think. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. Thanks for listening to my story. I'll see you in the next one.